We're not going to have the 7th pick this year. Lucky enough, we got bumped up. We got the 4th pick, so it's Christmas for Bulls fans, basically.
Right.
And I guess the first question I would have to ask you, Matt, is who would you prefer the Bulls to take at number 4?
Well, I guess it depends on whether or not you assume that the top 3 picks are going to go chalk. And it's not as concrete as it's been in recent years, but for the most part, and then especially over the last 48 hours or so, we've heard that despite all the smoke and all the rumors, it would be a surprise to not see LaMelo, Wiseman, and Edwards go top 3 in any particular order, but those being the top 3. If that's the case and the Bulls don't have LaMelo fall into their lap at 4, which I think would be great, but I personally don't think he's worth sacrificing a piece of our current core for to trade up to get LaMelo. I'm not that high on him. If that's the case, then you're looking at a few options at 4. A lot of Bulls fans are enamored with Denny Avdia, the young prospect from Israel, who projects to be kind of like a combo forward jack of all trades player that's enticing for today's NBA landscape. I personally would love to see them more seriously address the lack of playmaking on this roster. And now Denny's a good passer for a guy his size, but I do like the upside of some of the guards in this draft class, particularly Killian Hayes, the French product who played over in Germany this past year. I also like the possibility of Tyrese Halliburton being a guy who can play both on the ball and off the ball. He was pretty efficient as an off-the-ball shooter in his college careur. I also am pretty high on that kid, Kyra Lewis Jr. from Alabama. He has some interesting elements to his game. His Euro step is like flawless. It's like Tony Parker levels of Euro step. He's got some Dennis Schroeder mixed to his game. Crazy fast. So that's what I am hoping for on draft night. The Bulls have not had an answer at the point guard spot since Derrick Rose tore his ACL 8 years ago. And I would like that problem to be solved. I'm not convinced that it's going to be one of these players, but that's what I would like to see them try to address.
Look, when you're talking about Lewis from Alabama, I want to compare Alabama guard to Alabama guard. Do you see him being a better player than Sexton, or particularly more of a playmaker player than Sexton, who came out of Alabama a few years ago?
That's a good question. I think most people would say that Colin Sexton has been more of a disappointment based on projections coming out of the draft so far. And that's not to say he can't still improve and get better. I never saw him as a great playmaking guard. Certainly loved his athletic ability and what he could do creating as a primary ball handler for himself. But I also don't necessarily see brilliant playmaking from Lewis Jr. I see him as a guy who can certainly create his own shot off the dribble. He can drive. I would like to see better finishing at the rim from him. I think he's still a little bit too weak and needs to add some strength so that he can finish at the rim a little bit better. But I would say the comp isn't too far off, in my opinion, because they both appear to me to be, look to drive and penetrate and or create my own shot kind of guards more so than being playmaking guards. Whereas like Killian Hayes, very much a playmaking guard. Kyra Lewis Jr., I think, is more of just a use his speed and athletic ability to create primarily for himself.
Look, I want to talk about Killian Hayes and Tyrese Halliburton because I think if I had a choice between the two, I would probably go with the Frenchman. I know that he's not ambidextrous and he's just a lefty right now, but it seems like with his frame and his growth, and he's not a super athlete, but he's athletic, that in the long run, he may be able to transition into a star. While Halliburton being a guy who can play off the ball but also run an offense, I feel like he's just going to be probably like a sweet role player, perhaps, or even maybe better than that. But I feel like I want to swing for the fences if I was the Bulls, and they should go with their young Frenchman and Killian Hayes.
Yeah, I think you're right on the money there, Kenneth, because to me, when you look at mock drafts across the board over the past month or so, Killian Hayes is a guy who some have projected to go as high as 4 to the Bulls, all the way down to maybe even sliding into the late lottery, not going until 12th, 13th, 14th, something like that. And Tyrese Halliburton, you usually see in that little 7 to 10, 7 to 11 window, which, I mean, to me, the optics of that are clear. People, for the most part, agree that Killian Hayes has a higher potential ceiling than Tyrese Halliburton, but perhaps more of a bust risk, where Tyrese Halliburton is a guy with, multiple years of college experience and plenty of tape. You know what you're getting with him. So a higher floor, but also a lower ceiling. I think that's kind of the difference.
That David Show with Matt Peck, host of the Bulls Outsiders on NBC Sports Chicago for the past 2 seasons, and also Locked on Bulls podcast. You can find that anywhere where Locked on Bulls, Locked on anything is what I mean to say. Also follow him at Bulls underscore Peck. Listen, Matt, let me ask you this. Which player would you not want the Bulls to draft? Like, he's totally like, you're like, don't touch him. I don't want him to come down. And also include the chalk in that too.
Right. So including the chalk, I wouldn't be thrilled if somehow Wiseman fell to the Bulls at 4, and then the Bulls were like, well, do we think he's the best available? And then take him and then add to the already, log jammed kind of situation you have in the front court. I've heard some Bulls fans say, hey, let's trade up and sacrifice Wendell Carter to get Wiseman. I think that's ludicrous, personally. I feel like we've barely scratched the surface of what Wendell Carter Jr. can do, and with proper coaching and tutelage in the right system, we could really see him blossom. Another name that I think is kind of getting a lot of hype recently is Onyeka Okongwu. The forward from USC. Now, I certainly see a quality future for him in the NBA, but to me, his strengths and weaknesses kind of already mirror what Wendell Carter Jr. is. I mean, he's incredible as a help defender, a shot blocking rim protector. He's got a great basketball IQ on the defensive end. And I think he's a little bit more gifted than Wendell right now as a rim roller in a pick and roll kind of offense. And he's dynamic and athletic, finishing above the rim. So you like that, but he still does not have that range to his offensive game that Bulls fans were hoping to see Wendell Carter Jr. develop this season that we never saw. If anything, we saw Wendell kind of shy away offensively this season, even compared to his rookie year. So those two bigs, Wiseman and Okongwu, would be pieces that, if for whatever reason either of them ended up being the Bulls selection at 4, like, I could make my peace with it, but I wouldn't see as much logic behind it.
Matt, is there any worry when you're talking about Wendell Carter with the injury factor? I like Wendell Carter, but he's about one more injury away as far as a long duration of an injury from being like he's injury prone. Is there any fear that perhaps looking for a replacement or somebody that maybe can fit in and help, because maybe he may not be in the long-term plans? Because, I mean, I hate to say it, he's a tad bit injury prone.
Yeah, I think it's fair for Bulls fans to have that concern right now, just because you look at games played versus games missed through his first 2 years. I think it's fair that Bulls fans also have that worry about Lauri Markkanen through 3 years. He's missed a fair amount of time due to injury. We just heard the news maybe an hour before hopping on the mics here that the Bulls are not extending that qualifying offer to Chris Dunn, one of those pieces in the Butler trade. He's another guy who was injury prone and missed a lot of time. So I don't think it's wrong to say it's a concern for Wendell, but he has been one of several players to have injury issues with this team. We did hear they extended Denzel Valentine. He was mostly available this year, and Boylan just put him at the back end of his doghouse for whatever reasons. But he's coming back. He's been an injury concern. Otto Porter Jr. How much better would this Bulls team have been? Could this Bulls team have been this past season if their best two-way player, Otto Porter Jr., was available for more than a dozen games? So, yes, it's a concern with Wendell, but keep in mind he is still very young. And this could just be a series of unfortunate injuries at the beginning of his career. And he could have a very healthy career ahead of him. I mean, knock on wood on that. I think it's too soon to tell.
That David Show here with Matt Peck. Follow him at Bulls_Peck. Matt, real quick, let me ask you this. You mentioned that you wouldn't trade any of the core players to move up in the draft. So I'm taking that off the table. But which one of the core players are you closer to willing to be moving off of, because you don't think that necessarily he's going to make it and reach his full potential, or particularly reach that potential here as a Bulls player?
Yeah, this is a really hot button topic with Bulls fans right now. If you have to, separate yourself from one of the core 4 pieces, which one would you be most willing to part with? Logically speaking, I think, and as much as I love him and everything he did for this team for the past 2 plus years, the answer that makes the most sense is Zach LaVine. Wow. He has clearly the highest trade value of any piece of this roster right now. He's a guy coming off a year where he averaged nearly 25, 5, and 5, and he's got 2 more years of a very team-friendly deal on the books where he can be that kind of production for you, and he's making less than $20 million. Like, name the list of players in the NBA who can give you 25, 5, and 5 who make less than $20 million, because it's a pretty short list. For that reason, I think Zach has some pretty decent trade value right now. The other element to that is, from what we hear about AK, from what we've seen in Denver and the style of basketball that he likes to play, what Zach does on the offensive end doesn't necessarily mesh with what we are anticipating to see when it comes to this front office and this new coaching staff installing a new offensive system. Now, that's not to say that other pieces are more suited to what they're doing, but just that Zach is the most valuable piece who might be seen by the front office right now to be a square peg for a round hole.